said to have made huge amounts of money in his trading endeavors. And there are numerous stories about Milton Faver's gold being buried in one site or another, because it was his habit never to accept paper money. He insisted on being paid in gold or silver for his cattle and in trade. So he accumulated large stocks of metal money, and no one knows exactly where it is.
Well, people have also said that Milton, he would always get paid in gold, and he would always take one man out with him, and when he came back, he never returned with his man. He always came back by himself. So I don't think he wanted to be on the low man on the totem pole working for Milton Faver, because you might not return.
There's an old legend about him having numerous trips up into the mountains with gold, where he would, and this is the rumor, that he would take a couple of vaqueros up with him with the mules, go up into the mountains, and then come back in 2 to 3 days later, minus the vaqueros and the gold. So there is the old rumor of Milton's gold up in the mountains here, which still to this day, there's various stories about stashes of gold found or not found, or supposedly being hidden on the property.
The Big Bend area of Texas is, in my opinion, probably the most beautiful part of the state. It's an area of very high mountains. It's in the Chihuahuan Desert. The scenery is extraordinary, but it's very, very dry. And in that part of the state, water is life. Without water, you can't live.
The surface of planet Earth is 71% water. Where there is water, there is vegetation. Where there is vegetation, there is life. Yet there are places on Earth that have little or no water, and those who control the water control the land. In the 1850s in West Texas, a remarkable adventurer, Milton Faver, a man of mystery, led his family and workers from the relative safety of the pueblos of Mexico, clustered around the Rio Grande, to the area known as the Texas Big Bend. Faver had heard of a valley where water flowed freely from springs. He acquired the title to Cibolo Springs, the only abundant source of water in a narrow pass of considerable military and commercial importance. Located at the foot of some of the highest peaks of the Chinati Mountains, the spring has provided water without fail for thousands of years. And wherever there is water, there is life. A 150 years later, another adventurer, Dr. John Poindexter, led an army of historians, workers, and restoration experts to the great spring of the Cibolo to meticulously restore the world of Milton Faver, to resurrect 3 adobe forts to their former authentic state. Poindexter recalls his first sight of the desolation of Cibolo Creek Ranch.
Upon arrival, the property was desiccated. What little grass there was all brown. There was dust blowing, and there was nothing on the property except some deserted pens, cattle pens, out by the highway. And I looked at the broker. He looked at me, kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Give it a chance." So we drove down the highway, there being no roads available to enter the ranch. We actually trundled onto the ranch off the highway into a creek bed and drove up the creek bed, dodging boulders and the gravel and driving out of the creek bed when necessary in this poor broker's Suburban that barely survived the trip. And after about a 30-minute drive up the creek bed, we came out in a valley, which was, to me, beautiful and home at first sight. It was the place for me. The old fort, Cibolo Fort, was still in evidence. It was clothed in a white plaster. It was a barn and a maintenance shed. It had very little of its former glory still apparent, but it was the building. And you could just see with the majestic mountains rising behind it and the hills surrounding it like a donut, hole of a donut, this building right in the middle with the creek bisecting the valley, that this was the place, at least the place for me. And that was my first sight of the Cibolo Creek Ranch.
Poindexter's architect, Chris Carson, despite the appearance of the ranch, was intrigued.
When I first got here, we were coming across the creek bed, which was filled with a lot of tires, maybe some bed springs. And then we came up and saw the buildings, which were not in great shape. A lot of the walls were missing. Windows weren't in the same places that they were historically. And it was in pretty bad shape. Actually, the final building really has 3 areas, and so we had 2 of them pretty much intact. And the other part, which is to the north, really was pretty much gone, and just foundations that we later found there.
About 1/2 to 2/3 of the Cibolo Fort was present when we began reconstruction. We were fortunate enough to secure the services of the premier contractor in the area, James Cook, who declined to be a contractor because of the complexity of the job, but would be a building manager for us and would execute my instructions as we developed them and as the architect developed them. The task we set ourselves was to do everything as authentically as we possibly could. As a precursor, I visited every historical site that had a Mexican orientation in California, in Colorado, and in Texas that I could locate, New Mexico, very importantly, that I could locate. And the result of that was I acquired a very good sense of the way the place should look given what was there.
Poindexter brought in one of the best historical restoration architects in the state, Chris Carson, with the firm of Ford, Powell & Carson in San Antonio.
We are a San Antonio firm, and San Antonio has a great body of historic buildings, so it's been an interest to the firm and also of me for many, many years. I was a member of the Texas Historical Commission, and so great interest. We've done a lot of working on the Alamo, missions to San Antonio, all the way to the state capitol.
T.R. Fehrenbach is the distinguished author of Lone Star, A History of Texas and Texans. He was involved in the historical designation of the ranch.
Cibolo Creek Ranch is an anomaly in one sense. John Poindexter did a splendid job of restoration of the historical fort. This was not a ranch, really, it was a fort. The attraction of this particular place, this building, is new, but it was restored under painstakingly careful attention to restoring historical detail. I had nothing to do with that personally. I did have something to do with the awarding of the historical markers, both federal and Texas. At that time, I was on the Texas, well, I'm still on emeritus, but the Texas Historical Commission, which appoints the Board of Review, and the Board of Review gives the federal historical designation.
When John first asked me, he said, are you interested in this project? And I may interview a few other people. And I looked at it and I hadn't any idea of where it was going and where it was headed. But it was intriguing, and it was, John was very interesting. I couldn't tell really what he had in mind totally, and how far it would go. But there was enough here that was interesting, and so I really wanted to work on it.
To develop the plans required some creative thinking and careful measurements of the remains.
We took the surviving site, we counted the adobes in the wall, we measured the adobes, we then took the old surviving photographs from the 19th century, we counted the number of adobes present in the wall, we therefore were able to calculate exactly how high the walls should be where they had melted away. We rebuilt the walls to their proper height where they had melted down over the years to some extent. We constructed the walls that were missing in various places, and we followed the plans exactly. We did the archaeology on the site so as to find the old foundations, and the result was that we reconstructed a site which is nearly to the cubic inch what existed in the 1880s at its heyday today.
They built buildings of adobe, which you might think, well, it's just what was at hand, it was primitive. Adobe as such, it holds the heat in winter and it holds the coolness in summer, and made a lot more sense where there's no wood than bringing in lumbers, which the anglers begin to do. You don't have to bring lumber from wooded areas.
Actually, the adobes for the historic part were really made on this site. They were made really almost from the earth right in front of the building. And the way the adobes were built is that people came from around this area who had experience in doing adobes, and they built formwork. And they mixed the adobes, and I'm sure they put other things in it with straw and some other things that they knew what to do. They placed it in the forms, and then it's dried in the sun. And after it is dried enough, it comes out of the form, and it sits, and it's just baked by the sun. So it's exactly the way it was done originally. And the other interesting thing is that the building is plastered with the same adobe mud that you make the adobe blocks out of. And that gave it the color that it is. It's a very unusual brownish tan color, almost dark tan, dark brown. And the thing that intrigued me after it was done is when you drive up, it almost camouflages itself because it's so much the color of parts of the mountain range where they have exposed rock. So it's a very interesting thing that you would drive up and the building would not seem as large as it is until you actually arrived at the site. And it's another part of sort of a magical idea that happens here.
Adobe making is an art that even in northern Mexico has largely been lost. We first dug up the soil around the old fort so as to use the very dirt that composed the old adobe. So while the dirt might not be exactly in the adobe that it was formerly part of, it was back in the adobe that was put next to it. So we reconstructed all the adobes on site from the soil around the building and from a nearby site because we needed some more soil, put them together, and people wonder what adobe is. All adobe really is just mud. It's dried. There's a high clay content. So we produced them in forms like ladders. You pour the mud into a ladder and pick the ladder up, and where the ladder was are all these square blocks where the holes or the steps in the ladder divided the blocks. The idea is that every 10th block or so is held at about waist level, turned diagonally, and dropped. If it splits or is damaged seriously, that's a defective lot, and it's discarded. You start over again, it's dumped back in the mud hole, and you start all over again. Those that pass are then carried and erected, and they're very heavy, erected one at a time in the walls being anywhere from 2 to 4 feet thick, depending on what we found in the foundations.
The ranch is located in West Texas, near the town of Marfa, Its rich history is tied to the waters of Cibolo Creek. Where there is water, there is life. Cibolo's location near Marfa provides visitors to an area with another mystery, the Marfa Lights. The ghost lights appear in different ways to different people. All agree they glow softly, then brighten to the intensity of a stoplight. Those who say the lights are distant beacons, however, cannot account for the report of the lights before electricity or vehicles reach the Big Bend area. Since 1947, scientists have attempted to put the mystery to rest, but to no avail. Each year, the Marfa Lights Festival is celebrated on Labor Day around the historic Presidio County Courthouse with food, crafts, music, and dancing. The Big Bend has another ghost near Cibolo that attracts visitors, the ghost town of Shafter, where the history and citizens lie buried deep under the rocks of the desert.
Today, under the ghost town of Shafter, there are 75 miles of caverns, mostly cut by hand with explosives and pickaxes. The temperatures are very pleasant, constant 65 degrees or so. I've been in the caverns at length. They are gigantic in nature underneath the ground because some are 3-4 stories tall as they pursued the silver down, down, and down until that particular vein ran out. They follow very peculiar patterns like underground streams almost, up and down, following the veins of silver. The town of Shafter, at its peak, had 3,000 residents. It was a company town. It had cottages for the management. It had a large set of adobe structures around it for the miners. It had a tennis court.
A third important historical site near the ranch is Fort Davis. It has a number of well-preserved buildings such as officers' housing and barracks. Historian Cecilia Thompson has written a 2-volume history of Presidio County and the Big Bend.
The first military activity that was known out here, Fort Davis was established in 1854, I think it was. It was established for the purpose of guarding the trading trains, the freight trains that were going through to the West Coast, and also to help the guard the few natives who were living here, and to protect the area from the Indians. And the fort was established, of course, Fort Davis is 60 miles from here, but the soldiers would pursue tribes, the Indians that were marauding in the area, and they pursued them right through this particular area, and often the Indians retreated into Mexico.
Some